Hello, and welcome to The Good Word, simple term switches for creating a more inclusive campus. Thank you for taking the time to learn about some terminology and communication tools that can help you be more successful in your inclusion efforts with the Student Center. First, I want to take a moment to talk about why this is important to learn. Each aspect of a person's identity is an important piece of who they are. Respecting and valuing people's identities is a cornerstone of inclusiveness, which is one of our Student Center values. We interact with more than 17,000 people from all walks of life every day in our building, so we want to make sure that the language we use in our space reflects our values. Now, because so many aspects of identity are invisible or not immediately apparent, it's important that we never assume any of these identifications. Gender, spoken languages, family structure, marital status, student status, socioeconomic status, citizenship status, nationality, sexuality, relationships to others, religious practices, likes and dislikes, or abilities. For example, in thinking of the roughly 17,000 or so people who enter our building every day, it's important to know that as many as 100 different languages will be spoken. As many as 12 of the folks who come in will be transgender student or staff. More than 500 of the folks who come in will be low income. This is to say that the members of our community with these identities are in our spaces every day, so it's important that we make them feel welcome in our buildings by using inclusive language. We're going to start with the red terms. These are the most clear-cut terms that you should never use, especially when representing the Student Center and Georgia Tech. First, let me say that several of these words are probably words you currently use, but were unaware of the harmful impact they have. There is zero judgment in that, you simply didn't know, and these things take time to unlearn. That's important for you to remember, as you'll likely find problematic terms throughout this training that you use daily. Now that you will know, I encourage you to work hard to scrub them from your vocabulary, and given some time and practice with the tools we'll discuss, you can encourage others to do better as well. First, we have gypped, which is derived from gypsy. Both are slurs and should not be used. Instead of gypped, I encourage you to use cheated, and instead of gypsy, use Romani, which is the preferred term for people of that ethnicity. Being careful about using the term Indian is important, especially given the number of students we have at Georgia Tech who are from India. But when referring to Indigenous folks, there are actually several terms that may be a better choice, and that's why there's an asterisk there. We'll come back to that. Related to that, powwows are important rituals for Native communities, and when you use that term in reference to a hangout or just a quick meeting that you have, it really trivializes the significance of those events. Savage is loaded with historical trauma for Native folks, so using the terms mean or harsh instead is a far better choice. In a similar way, spirit animal is a term that really belongs to Native communities and shouldn't be used in a casual way. Instead of disabled or even handicapped person, you want to use person first language, which is to say person with a disability. Lame is a really hard one, I know, for a lot of folks, but that term harms folks with mobility issues in the same way that the R word listed below harms folks with learning differences. Midget is also a slur, and while some folks do have a medical condition called dwarfism, you should generally avoid both of those terms and use little person instead. The R word I shouldn't have to explain. You'll often find that the words you mean to say are silly or ridiculous instead, so you should just go ahead and switch those out. And when it comes to autistic as a term, it's better to use the person first language like a person with autism. Alternately, neuroatypical is used more and more frequently these days and is another acceptable term. Crazy, insane, nuts, and psycho are really triggering terms for folks with mental illness, and so while this one is really tough for a lot of folks, you should switch to things like wild, intense, super, whatever is a better representation of what you're trying to say. OCD, ADD, bipolar disorder, and addiction are real psychiatric conditions and not just you being a neat freak or being moody. So when you use those terms in that way, it trivializes the experience of mental illness. A better term would be like what you see on the right, neat, intense, focused, etc. This last one is so critical here at Georgia Tech, and all I'll say is this. You never want to make light of such a serious things, and being casual about suicide is harmful to our entire community. Finally, this last list that pops up is a little more comprehensive look at person-first language and how it works. Take a good look at the different ways that person-first language can be expressed and maybe start working some of these into your vocabulary. Now on to the red-ish terms. This next set are not terms that are outright slurs, but in an environment like ours where so many parts of a person's identity are unknowable, it is far too easy to make someone feel excluded from our space and our community. Making these switches signals to those same folks that they belong here at Georgia Tech and in the Student Center. Rather than relying on the gendered binaries of he and she or his and hers, make the switch to the gender-inclusive they, them, their. As a side note, when referring to a single person using they, them, and their, you can use their self or themself. Instead of relying on Mr. or Ms., using mix is often good as it is more inclusive of non-binary folks. It's also good to use in emails or communications when you don't know the recipient's gender. As with the above, man and woman or men and women is not as inclusive as person or people, folks, or everyone. Mom and dad can be used to the more gender-inclusive parents, but I caution that parents is actually not always a safe word to use, as some folks may have lost their parents or been in less typical family scenarios. The more gender-inclusive version of son and daughter is child, kid, or student, with husband and wife switching to spouse, significant other, or partner is far more inclusive of many different identities. Sister and brother can be switched to siblings, which is again more inclusive of all genders. And when it comes to guys, ladies, and dudes, it's better to use folks, friends, and y'all. And I know, folks, I still struggle with guys myself. That's a really tough one, but y'all means all, so let's say y'all, y'all. Use of male or female is both exclusive of intersex folks and also puts the emphasis on our anatomy rather than who we are as people. Further to this, using male or female to describe folks in professions that are not historically associated with a particular gender, such as male nurse or female pilot, is exclusive to trans folks in those professions. Instead, you could say men who are nurses, or better yet, just nurses. Latino and Latina is a gendered binary, whereas Latinx is a gender-inclusive term for folks of Latin American descent that you should use. You don't necessarily want to use terms that are based on gendered binaries like waiter or waitress, especially when there is a non-gendered option like server. And rather than salesman or saleswoman, make that person a salesperson. The question, "Where are you from?" carries a negative and exclusionary tone, whereas asking about where a person is visiting from makes no assumptions about their citizenship. Asking "Where are your parents?" is problematic, as this assumes everyone still has close relationships with their parents. In this case, asking "Do you have any guests with you?" is better. It's not great to ask "Where is your student?" as this question assumes the person you're speaking to isn't a student. Asking if they are our new student reserves any assumption about their student status and potentially makes their day if they are not in fact our new student. Using Merry Christmas around the winter holidays assumes that everyone around celebrates Christmas, which may not be the case. Happy Holidays is much more inclusive. It's important to remember also that nothing is normal other than what may be normal for you. However, some things might be typical, and typical is a much better term to use when generalizing a behavior or trait. All of the terms on this slide are some of the hardest ones to switch to, as rhetorical habits like his or hers are deeply ingrained in us, like a muscle memory. It takes practice, and while you should hold yourself accountable when you do mess up, you should also give yourself a break. Now on to the yellow terms. These are terms that could be just fine to use in certain contexts, but could be loaded with historical trauma or have negative connotations for many. Unless you really know the context you're in, we encourage you to make these switches. Both the terms old and elderly carry negative connotations, so when referring to members of our community with more life experience, seniors is the preferred term. As I said before, parents and family can be triggering terms for people who, for whatever reason, don't have parents or family in their life. The terms guests or loved ones are inclusive of a wider spectrum of personal relationships. When it comes to the term kid, if you're talking about a 10-year-old, great. If you're talking about a baby goat, wonderful. If you're talking about a fellow student at Georgia Tech, however, it's far more respectful to use the term student. There's no clear-cut switch term for gay, as it's an acceptable word in many contexts. We just want to make sure that you don't use it flippantly and certainly don't use the term negatively. Similar to that, queer has seen a rise in popularity with younger generations and is in fact how some people identify themselves, but it's important to remember that some older members of the community still remember when that was used as a slur against them. So again, there's no clear-cut switch term, but this is one to use with caution unless you're referring to someone who uses that term to identify themselves. The term Native American is tricky because America as a concept came after Native cultures were already established, but those who live in the US are US citizens. So again, it's a tricky one. Indigenous or Native folks are the most general, and in that way, those are the best. First Nations is also a pretty general term, but is more specific to Canada. The term minorities is tricky because it's really more about accuracy than anything, as some marginalized folks are in fact in the majority, such as women. This switch also puts the negative connotation on the ones doing the marginalizing. The term housekeeping has a gendered history, but it is still widely used in the hospitality industry. Here in the Student Center, we prefer the term custodial. Policing is really just a loaded word to use. Sometimes you may find that using monitoring instead is a good switch, otherwise maybe avoid this in general. Hysterical is an interesting one because its root word is Greek for uterus. So to say that someone is hysterically crying or telling them not to get hysterical has misogynistic roots. However, saying that someone is hysterically funny is absolutely fine, as women often are. Using cheap and affordable are tough because it assumes everyone is at the same income level. It's a relative term and is best to avoid in general. Now on to the green terms. Beyond the switch terms outlined in this training, here are some other useful tools to make your communications more inclusive. First, using a person's preferred pronouns is a foundational part of inclusive language. We talked about pronouns in all staff training, but essentially this is using she, her, hers to refer to people who identify as women, using he, him, his for people who identify as men, and using they, them, their for non-binary folks or for folks whose gender identity you don't yet know. The key is knowing how someone identifies. The easiest ways to find out is to say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so and I use these pronouns. What pronouns do you use?" And then respect what they say. This is a super important part of creating an inclusive environment in the Student Center, so if you need a more detailed refresher on pronouns, please ask your supervisor or me. Another great tool is using the person-first language that was covered in a previous slide. For example, a person with low vision. Naming the dominant group anytime you would name the non-dominant group. When we only use an extra term to name the non-dominant group, it suggests that the dominant group is what's normal, natural, and acceptable. By naming both groups, you allow them to have equal value, even if one is less common. Y'all is wonderful because it means all y'all, but it's especially appropriate for us here in the South. And again, remember that nothing is normal, but some things may be typical. We've covered a lot of tips like using the words you truly mean and saying your pronouns first. Here you have a few practices that, once you develop them, will make inclusive language your everyday language. First, learn to ask open-ended questions. So rather than asking a question based on an assumption like, "Don't you eat tacos?" you can ask a more inclusive question such as, "What kind of food do you like?" Next, use the terms others use for themselves. If you hear someone use a term to identify themselves, use it. A Native person would be a good example. They may use the term Cherokee or Indigenous or something else entirely. Use what they use when referring to them. Pronouns are also a good place to start. Learn the context of idioms. Do a wiki dive on some of these. You may find you use common phrases that have problematic origins, like no can do. If you don't really know where the phrase you're using came from, maybe don't. Educate yourself and expand your cultural competency. There are a lot of great trainings out there like Safe Space Training and opportunities in Atlanta to learn more about other cultures. Engage in conversation with folks and listen when they tell you about the experiences they have that are not like yours. When you understand more about other identities, you can more easily avoid language that will harm those communities and help take some of the burden off of them in educating others about that identity. Own your mistakes and call others in when they make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes, it's part of the work, but it's critical not to let it slide. When you catch yourself, make a mental note, and eventually you will start to catch yourself before you say the wrong thing. In the same way that you should correct but not beat yourself down, you should call others in when you hear them using uninclusive language. So what does it mean to call others in? It's a productive way to address uninclusive language. I say productive because our usual practice, calling someone out, is not effective in changing their language or their mind. Why? Because being called out makes you defensive. You feel shame, and no one likes to feel shame. In trying to avoid shame, folks will shut down in the conversation and no progress will be made. And as much as you might want to blast some people with this amazing gift to let them know they're using racist language, it's not an effective way to engage them. Calling in, on the other hand, is a productive way to educate the person on the harmful impact of their words without implying that they themselves are an inherently hateful person. You can find other ways to say this, but if you need a template, a good way to start is by telling them, "Hey friend, you're a part of this community and I care about you. I don't know if you know, but what you just said causes harm." From there, you can have a more in-depth conversation about how and why they should change their language, because you've opened a dialogue rooted in the idea of community care. Now that you have the terms to switch to and the tools to engage in the conversation about inclusive language, what's next? The Qualtrics form you'll fill out is a stop, start, continue exercise. Take a few moments to think about your own language and where you want to do better. Then tell us, what about your language choices do you want to stop? Which of the tools or terms you've seen here that you want to start using? And which of your current behaviors do you want to continue? Beyond that, be prepared to talk about this training with your team, your supervisor, and me. I know this list is incomplete, and I welcome your feedback on how terms are presented here. Language is constantly evolving, so I expect this list of terms to change with time, but that can only happen with your feedback and insights. This should be the beginning of an ongoing dialogue. I want to thank you for your attention during this training and for your help in creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment at Georgia Tech.